Hello, time for another Man in Gray book for you. Today's book is The Taiping Rebellion, A History from Beginning to End by Hourly History, published in 2021. It's 60 pages long. Little known outside of China, the Taiping Rebellion was the bloodiest war of the 19th century and the bloodiest civil war in human history. It began in 1850 and ended 14 years later in 1864. And by the time the rebellion was finally put down, somewhere at least 20 million people were killed, possibly as many as 30 million. But at least 20 million people were killed, which was about 5% of the total population of China at the time. So an unbelievably bloody war. Now, this short book gives a quick summary of the war and some of the causes that led to this rebellion. The rebellion was against the Qing dynasty. Now, the Qing dynasty was the last imperial dynasty to rule China. It was established in 1644, and it was basically the rulers, the emperor, and all the people around him were from Manchuria. They were Manchurians, and that was part of the resentment that eventually developed because the majority of Chinese were ethnic Hans, and so the Manchurians were kind of a minority within China, but they took over the government and controlled it. Now, for about 100 years, things were going pretty well for the Qing dynasty. They expanded their borders. They brought peace and stability to the country. They set up a series of civil service exams so that the most talented people in various precincts could rise to the top. And everything looked like it was going well. But below the surface, there was a lot of resentment toward the Manchurian outsiders who were controlling the country. There was a series of natural disasters and droughts, which led to famines in various parts of China, particularly in the south part of China. And so there was growing resentment toward the Qing dynasty and its regional governors. And they were also resentful of the high taxes that were being charged. The leader of the rebellion was an unlikely figure. He was a young man named Hong Xiaotran, and Hong Xiaotran had dreams of becoming a civil servant, but he failed the civil service exam multiple times and became despondent and increasingly resentful. And he came down with a severe fever that almost killed him. And during the fever, he had a series of violent hallucinations. And sometime later, after reading a pamphlet by a Chinese missionary, Xiaotran became convinced that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, that he had been sent by God to China to lead a revolution that would overturn the evil Qing dynasty, which he is associated with Satan and demons. The emperor was a demon. And so he was sent to overthrow the government and establish a new order, a new kingdom of peace in the world. And in Xiaotran's vision, there was going to be equality between both genders. Male and females would be treated equally, and all racial groups within China were going to be treated equally as well. The taxation would be fair. Wouldn't have some groups paying more tax than others. So his message, strange as it was and unusual as it was for China at the time, caught on, particularly with peasants in the southern part of China. They really adopted this. Another thing that Xiaotran was opposed to was the traditional Confucian religion, Confucianism, which argued for the status quo, ancestor worship, and everything. And he was arguing that it was this traditionalism which was oppressing the people. And so this message caught on within a group of people in the southern part of China. First, the military leaders of the Qing dynasty didn't take this rebellion very seriously because they were peasants and they were poorly armed. Most of them were armed with homemade weapons, spears that they crafted themselves. Occasionally, they would capture weapons, but they weren't very well armed, but they were well trained. Xiaotran's brother became one of the military leaders, and he trained these people, and they won a series of minor skirmishes early on in 1850. And after every victory, more and more people joined forces, and eventually it wasn't just peasants, but the middle class that saw a chance to improve themselves. And again, general resentment of the Manchurians was a factor in this. And so at one point, by the mid 1850s, the Taiping rebels controlled most of southern China. Now, one of the key reasons for this is the European powers, who had a huge influence on China, were taking a kind of neutral stance during this war. Some of them were sympathetic to what the Taiping rebels were up to. The European powers were Christian. This guy was sort of a quasi-Christian, and so they said, "Well, let's not interfere." So at first, they kind of stood back and took a neutral position. So it looked for a while like the revolution might actually succeed and overthrow the Qing dynasty, but a number of factors occurred by the end of the 1850s which turned the tide. And one of them was their failure to capture Peking, or what is now Beijing. They had a chance to seize the city when it was almost completely undefended, but they didn't know that, and they attacked another city instead, and this gave the chance for the Qing dynasty forces to reinforce Peking, and so the capital didn't fall. If they had taken the capital, it might have led to the whole collapse of the dynasty. The emperor would have been overturned. Another thing that happened is there became a series of internal disputes between various leaders. There were 4 military leaders, one for each part of China, and they began to feud among themselves. But the final blow was the death of their leader, the guy who started the whole thing. Hong Xiaotren died during a siege. The people in the particular city were starving, and he was convinced that God had told them that they could eat weeds. And this would be like manna from heaven during Moses' time in the wilderness. And so he pulled up a bunch of weeds and started eating them, but they were poisonous, and he wound up getting sick and dying a few days later. Well, since the whole thing was based on his idea that he was Jesus Christ's younger brother, when he died suddenly, a lot of people lost faith in the movement. And then the other thing that happened was the Europeans eventually changed their mind and decided to help crush the rebels because it was interfering with their opium trade. They were making a lot of money buying and selling opium in China, and the Qing dynasty was complicit in that. One of the things about the Taiping rebels is they were anti-drugs. They were saying, we're going to stop this opium trade. And the Europeans said, well, we can't have that because we're making too much money of it. So they began supporting the Qing dynasty, and eventually the forces were defeated slowly, one by one, and by 1864, the forces were basically wiped out. There were some rebels that retreated to the mountains and continued to hold hit-and-run raids up until about 1870. So if you want to count that part, the war was actually 20 years long, over 20 years long before it was completely wiped out. It did have some long-term effects, though. Even though the Qing dynasty won the war, it weakened them substantially. And in 1911, a second rebellion arose, and that did overthrow the government. In 1912, the Qing dynasty was ended when the emperor resigned, and Sun Yat-sen was elected president of the Republic of China, the first democratically elected leader in Chinese history, and that brought an end to the imperial rule of China. So the Taiping Rebellion, even though it failed, it did lead to the ultimate collapse of the Qing dynasty a half century later. It also was one of the inspirations for the communist rebels led by Mao Zedong in the 1940s. Mao Zedong saw how these peasants, who were poorly armed but fanatically devoted to their cause, could defeat a much larger army. And this inspired him to build up a same sort of army, only based on communist principles rather than this quasi-Christianity that the Taiping Rebellion was based on. So it's a fascinating part of Chinese history, one that I think Westerners would do well to study because it has had a lot of long-term effects, and the fact that it was such a violent, bloody war, and yet very little known in the West. This book, being only 60 pages long, kind of gives you a quick summary of the war, and if you become interested in it, you may want to read other longer books that have more detail, or a biography of the people involved. The book is called Taiping Rebellion, A History from Beginning to End by Hourly History. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.